and speaking in a language that private sector understands. Very important.
Yeah, definitely. And Diane, to just come to you, to piggyback from what he has just said, just from a banking perspective and your experience here in Rwanda, is there demand? I mean, when you look at the financial products, do you see that that is a market that can be tapped into by different financial institutions?
Absolutely. When you look at financial inclusion in Rwanda, it's above 90%. But only about 40% of those are, bankable or are banks clients. So you have a big gap of people who are included because they have a phone and they can access financial services through digital means, like from telcos. But we look at people and we think of return and profit in the long term. We believe that today it makes sense for us to bank a smallholder farmer as much as it makes sense for us to bank a refugee, because these people have, tomorrow they'll have probably bigger farms, and if you give them the right products and the right support, they'll be able to grow their business. So that you really need to take a long-term perspective when you are banking some or onboarding some segments, because the short-term gain is not there. But again, because we've made it very easy and affordable for us to onboard these people, it does not matter. Adding one more client will cost us less than $1, which then it makes sense, because this person, you think of the lifetime of banking this person will have a business, will have a family, etc., and this would make sense in the longer term. So yes, I think it makes sense. I think there's a business case for us to include everyone. And we talk very much about a cashless or cash light society here. This will only happen when everyone is included, because you need to transfer and pay, etc., through digital means. And you need everyone to be included to do that, because from my perspective, from where I come from, cash is extremely expensive, because we pay, we have hundreds, thousands of cashiers. We pay for cash transport, cash in transit. We pay for insurance for the cash that is circulating. It's extremely expensive. So the day we're able to reduce these costs, we'll be able to offer even better terms to our clients for loans, etc. Thank you.
Yes, as Dan said, cash is really expensive, and we are going to leave this panel discussion today with solutions. What needs to be done to drive up financial inclusion? And if you're watching us at home on CNBC Africa, you can also be part of the conversation. Feel free to use the hashtag 36millionsolutions to share in your questions as well as comments. And also, if you're part of the audience, you're not left behind. We'll also come to you later on during the conversation. So if you have questions, just do note them down, and we'll give you a chance to ask them. Now, my next question is to you, Donald. Just looking at statistics, globally, forced displacement numbers, they have almost doubled. And here in Africa, we're looking at the numbers, we're standing at 36 million. Just the question is, in the past decade, a lot has changed, but we're clearly not succeeding in this area. There's still a lot that needs to be done. There still needs solutions to be put in place. So what integration solutions should we be looking at in the space of finance?
Yeah. I think it is important to make a distinction between issues of financial inclusion in general for many Africans and issues of financial inclusion among internally displaced persons. There's a very big difference, and the tools are different. I thought we were discussing IDPs and refugees. So the second, I visited a camp in Myanmar, camp of these internally displaced persons for another activities. Actually, what shocked me, I didn't know, I have now understood, that one of the problems you'll face with internally displaced persons, that they don't even have an identity. They have an identity because they feel insecure, they are not safe. So before you talk about giving them a loan or giving them facilities, who are they? No one knows. And I believe really the issue number one for all of us, at least for IDPs, I mean for people here who are handling these issues, is to understand that IDPs are not refugees. They're in their own country. They have the rights like every other citizen. The only difference is that they have fled from their home to a new home, forcibly, because of climate or because of conflict. And therefore, the tools we think about must adjust to that particular risk environment. My third point before the last. There's a study by the World Bank, which I think we'll be discussing here. I can't recall the year in Kenya. I think in the Turkana region of Kenya, where they try to assess in this camp, I've forgotten the name, what is the size of the economy here? And it was estimated by FC at the time at about $53 million. In other words, you look at the transactions going on in that particular camp. It was $53 million. So people like Diane, the bankers, have opportunities there. But the problem is, the one I've just mentioned, identity. And then someone coming to help them take off some of the risks. I was hoping that some of the organizations involved in the IDPs, instead of handling these people as a humanitarian angle, give them food, medicine, they could use some of the tools they have, some of the grants they have, some of the resources they have to enable financial institutions actually to do their job by picking off some of the risks. And finally, let me tell everyone here that Africa's longest failed state is in Somalia. There have not been a viable government until recently, since 1991. So, for all intents and purposes, it is the most risky place to do business. What has kept the people of Somalia going has been the innovation, inventiveness of businesses, from telecom companies, from people who transfer money through the Habshil, many others, sometimes up to 2 billion a year. And this money has gone to drive a lot of economic activities in the camps, in the IDPs. So I do want to emphasize, Chair, we're talking about people who have not left their country, right? So the first port of call is governments. Whether businesses come in, governments cannot run away from the fact that they have responsibilities for their citizens. They might have left the north to the south, or east to west. So public money will still be needed. The issue is, how could we integrate the public money available and from international organizations to enable private companies, to enable banks, to provide a service to these people? One thing the government may have to do to begin with is provide these people identity. All right? It's their right. Second, provide them safety. If they left their place of abode, they felt insecure. All right? Third, provide them the services which governments always provide, education, health, and so on. If you do that, which are the basics, then private business will find a way to take advantage of some of those things. But please let us make a distinction between financial inclusion, which you're discussing, in normal steady state situations, and situations like refugee camps. That's not my subject, but like where you have IDPs. By the way, we call them internally displaced persons. Don't think about a year, 2 or 3. Sometimes they could be internally displaced for over 10, 15 years, as in Colombia, in the Philippines. So you're talking about a long-term problem. And I believe, without oversimplifying, it simply can't be business. It will have to be business working with governments, each one of them deploying the instruments they have to make, sorry Diana, I'm going to use a word which is nowadays very fashionable, to do well while doing good. All right? So you make a bit of money, but also you enable these people to earn a living.
Yeah, I can see Vusi wants to add something. But before you do, I just want to ask, how then can we move? Because you said the governments have a role to play. Yes, they do. But how can we move from saying if to let's take action now?
Okay, so let me pick a case. I don't want to mention the country because that would be very complicated. So 1 million people have moved from one part of the country to another part of the country. Men, women, and children. Many of these people are highly qualified. They are doctors, they are teachers, they are engineers, they are farmers, so they know what to do. All right? But they have to be given an environment where actually they can begin to apply their talent and innovation. All right? So that is number one. It's the role of government. They have to be given safety and an environment for them to operate. All right? Ideally, they should go back to their origin. But sometimes because of climatic reasons, sometimes because of security concerns, they can't go back. They have moved almost forever. I suppose the point I'm making is, at least for IDPs, we simply can't say this about business alone. It won't be. It will have to be governments and international organizations, each one of them deploying the tools and the instruments they have, rather than to use them as a closed envelope to enable companies, to enable businesses, those who provide education, health, financial services, energy, and so on, to do what they do. I suppose I'm biased because of my background. I'm biased because I've had a role to figure out how the institution I was leading could actually provide livelihoods in places like South Sudan, the Central African Republic, the Mano River area at the time, even Somalia. And I always found that you succeed best where governments assume their responsibility and they open channels for business, but picking some of the risks which business, of course, are not prepared to assume. Except telephone companies, those risks are very low. Cost of entry are very low. The risks they run are very low, so you find them active. But for banks, it's perhaps a bit to ask them alone to assume the risks involved in operating in those environments without some de-risking instruments from international organizations or governments. But as I say, I'm biased.
Okay, and Vusi, you're in the private sector. I could see you wanted to add something.
Yeah, with respect to, and I think the doctor is correct, but I think we're coming at this, I think there is an overlap generally in terms of how you drive financial inclusion. Africa is Africa, and the issues of exclusion permeate whether or not we're talking about people who are IDPs or not. But let's narrow it to this IDP discussion. A big part of the challenge, with respect, Doc, is that from my perspective, and I hasten to say, would be the perspective of many people in private sector, government doesn't lead. And so if we are to have a discussion about how do you get private sector involved, then the presumption is that private sector can't wait for government to do it. If they were to, they would have. We wouldn't be having the discussion. So it's true indeed that you need a policy framework that makes it possible for private sector to do so. And this I agree with you. Yourself being a former banker and a financier, you understand better than I how you would price that risk and understand how to operate in the market. On this, we are agreed. And I certainly share the sentiment around identity, just to do basic KYC, AML, all of those things are true. But I think that the challenge from the private sector's perspective is seeing the opportunity beyond policy certainty. If we are to wait for policy to be certain or favorable, then we're going to continue to wait. I think the opportunity, frankly, if I may be candid, is for those who are charged with the responsibility of driving inclusion for IDPs to have a direct conversation and relationship with the private sector and tag along with it to the public sector. But I think to tether and say, well, the one has to happen as a consequence of the other, then it's going to slow down the process. And by the way, just a final note, this is actually happening in many parts of the continent already. The people I work with, the young people, the under 30s, under 40s, the tech startups, the innovators who are, whether they're using a series of Python code or blockchain, are thinking about how do we take new technology and include people who've not traditionally been included in traditional systems, right? So there is an element of it that's happening because this little device we're all carrying has changed access. So I just want to say, and I say this with humility, but I want to make this point very pointedly, that we have to put pressure on governments to follow the process, and we have to accelerate the process. If we wait, I think we're going, that's just my sense. But
let me say, first of all, what you say about governments when they fail to do their job is right. But let me tell you a story, and it's real. One time, I get a call from the chairman of Barclays Bank telling me that they are stopping all remittances to Somalia. They will not be involved. I had actually to appeal to the British government at the time. Please, allow this lifeline to continue, because these people know how to do their KYC. They have done it for 20 years. What you are saying, all right? Because there's no government in Somalia to do that, all right? So there'll be cases where governments don't exist as in Somalia to do the job, but there are cases where we cannot let governments get out just like that.
Sure.
It's just not possible. Because IDPs are citizens. They have a right, at least to an identity document, all right? The fact that an IDP has left one part of the country to another cannot deprive him of the right to have his document. Now, government may be willing or unwilling to do it, but it is their responsibility. Now, so there'll be extreme cases like Somalia, which I've just mentioned. In this case, I failed. Banks, I think in many places in Europe, refused to participate in these transfers. Luckily, there was the Habshil, which found a way to continue doing it. So you have this continuum. But I suppose what I'm saying here is, at least for IDPs, refugees have crossed the border. And there's an international convention of 1951 which deals with refugees. There's no international convention which gives protection to IDPs because they are within their own country. And so I want to encourage the private sector to please use your innovation, find out solutions. But I suppose I'm using this public platform to say to governments, they absolutely have a responsibility to IDPs. And this is one thing we said to the Secretary General of the UN.
Okay, and to just bring everyone into this conversation, Diane, I'm coming to you. We've heard from what Dr. Donald Kaberuka has said, as well as Vusi, representing the private sector. As a bank, the products that are out there in the market, they are for general use. So what will it take? Will it be a policy shift when you look at financial institutions? What will it take to just have tailor-made solutions or just have these initiatives being included in the bank's mandate?
Thank you. Maybe I'll piggyback to the discussion that is happening here. Obviously in Rwanda, maybe because of experience, all of us, many of us have a history of being a refugee. I was born from refugee parents. I'm sure, Dr. Kaberuka the same. In every family, you have, someone, we're all refugees basically. And we've been able to, our government has been able to establish a system where, everyone is counted, everyone is registered somewhere. And that's even why, all these other programs, the vaccination programs are successful because we know how many people we have, where they live, who they are, and you can track even how many, when you go for the first dose and the second dose, everything is tracked. But this is only Rwanda. I mean, in many countries in our region, people live without ID cards. I mean, forever. A lifetime. You'll find people, a student maybe will have a student ID, a citizen will have a voter card or something. There's no identification. And in this context, banks and other private sector operators have to find a way to operate. And that's why, that's why, you'll accept anything. Someone gives you a student ID that is dated 20 years back, you'll take that because you still see the opportunity in the person, So coming back to that, when we see clients, we don't see refugees in them. We see, potential business people who have small businesses, who are traders. We have a big segment of clients who are women trading across border. It's massive, people who cross the border from Rubavu or Rusizi every day to the Congo. And it's a lot of money, and there's a lot of value being created, and this is feeding families. So you have to find a way to support these people. So when we look at clients, we look at the business the business they do. We look at the revenues they make. We see if the margins they make will enable them to pay us back. And this is everything we look at. So I think when you see a person, you see an opportunity. You have to see the opportunity. And only when you see a person as an opportunity can you make business. Otherwise, I think even telcos, if you come to a place where you don't see opportunities into people, there's no way you can do business.
Yeah, and Bior, just coming to you and to touch on what Dr. Kaberuka had said earlier on, these products may be available, but at the end of the day, some of the marginalized communities may not be able to access these because of lack of confidence, as he had said, or maybe other factors. So how best do you think we should approach these and just drive up financial inclusion?
Well, first of all, in the case of Rwanda, it seems like refugees have it good here compared to other countries. Because here we're talking financial inclusion. In the case of Kenya, where I grew up, refugees cannot work. And how can we discuss financial inclusions for people that are not allowed to participate in the economy? So Kenya's refugees are passive participants in their economy. And then we're talking about banking and financial inclusion in the financial institutions. So where do they start? Where is that capital? Because at the end of the day, when you go to a bank to seek financing, they want a track record. They want your financial history. But refugees do not have any of that. So the questions become, we need political will in the first place. So for refugees to be able to access financial, the banks, the private sector can say, okay, we are all in. We want you to be included in our financial services, all aboard. But if there's no financial will and we have rigid political policies in place, that is a barrier. And that is one of the first things that we need to tackle.
Yeah, so how do we drive it up? Well, we live in a digital era. We're seeing new tools that are coming. As you said, our phones, they're very powerful tools, and mobile penetration is rising here on the continent. So how can we leverage on the tools that we already have to actually try and make ends meet, to actually try, for example, use of cryptocurrency or even blockchain? That can also help us. As you said, going to bank, you do not have history, but how can we leverage on the tools that we already have?
Well, it's been gradually and surely going well, where the digital currency, the case of Kenya M-Pesa, and people have access to small loans on their mobile phones now through M-Kopa. It's a very good thing because it bridges the delay that happened in the money that comes from UNHCR in the forms of what they call Bamba Chakula. So if you have an immediate need for cash and your Bamba Chakula has not arrived yet, you have that avenue to borrow quickly, and when your Bamba Chakula comes, you can pay it back. That has been a really helpful tool. Before that, there was no such thing as refugees just marching to the bank to borrow as little as, 5,000, just without collateral or no financial history. So it has really facilitated that access to financing.
Okay, Vusi?
Yesterday I met a fascinating young man at the cocktail dinner who's built one of these genome sequencing businesses here in Rwanda, and he was telling me all about what he's doing, and I said to him, I'd love to see both the white paper and his pitch deck because he's raising capital and that's what we do. But to your comment about blockchain, I think we have to remember that one of the challenges we have generally, Doc, and you would know this better than I, is that not only do we have an issue of displaced persons, we also have an issue of unrecorded births. So actually from the point of birth, a citizen isn't recorded in the registry, which means how do you drive inclusion of somebody who's not in the very database? My excitement, the things we're doing, the entrepreneurs we're financing, the technologies they're building, is because it really is aimed at how do you drive inclusion of people who are not in the mainstream. And a whole host of these. By the way, it's happening right now as we speak. I'll give you a simple example. There are young Nigerians today as we speak who are hedging the inflation or the volatility of the Naira using cryptos and moving money around the world without clearing it through the Reserve Bank. Now, to some of us, this sounds like gobbledygook, but the point I'm making is the following, that in particular what we're seeing with the energy and the fervor of these young people is that they're willing to find solutions without waiting for large institutions, big business, government to get involved. My sense is that we can do one of two things. The first is we can ignore it, or the second is we can really think meaningfully about how do we partner with it, leverage it, so that we can achieve the things that we want to achieve. From where I'm sitting, I'm looking at this going, this is a fantastic opportunity. because you've got an economy, an entire economy around refugees, an entire economy around IDPs. And all of these issues, if you tackle them in one region, you actually tackle them across the region. And that gives you economies of scale. It answers all of the questions. This is what I meant when I was saying that capital will never cheat on return. What we've got to figure out is how do you drive the return side of the equation, the capital will flow, in particular from private sector.
Definitely. Thank you so much. We are now going to open up the conversation to the audience. If you have a question, remember, just switch on the light. Oh, we can already, yeah, we have 2 lights already on this side. Yeah, if you could just stand up, say your names, where you're from, and do direct the questions to one of the panelists.
Okay. My name is David Etim. I'm from Nigeria. I'm the Deputy President of the Calabar Chamber of Commerce. And I'm a second-generation entrepreneur. Now, I want to align strictly with there are two camps on the stage right now. There's developmental finance and there's private sector money. They two have totally different consciousness. Developmental finance can do a lot of things in terms of inclusion, but private sector money is shy, so it doesn't like risk. Okay, he has said it. It's in love with return, so it doesn't leave return behind. And so for private sector money to get involved in this whole process, the issue Mr. Kiwaruka has mentioned, I hope I pronounce it correctly, the issue of de-risking. It's critical that investments in whether they're IDPs or refugees is de-risked. The only commodity that these people have is their skill. That's the only thing they can use and cross the border and move away with. Okay? So how are they able to sell that skill for return? Now, that's the issue. Now, with the private sector is willing to buy skill for value to get value. Okay? So how do you get the issues of a man that is off record, is not captured, to be able to be located, to be able to be, the telcos are able to lock him in because of his phone number. And they do the biometrics and all of that, so they can position him. But I'm not a telco. I'm a businessman, I need a skill, and I need to be sure that when that guy does the work, he'll come back tomorrow to do it. I'm not every day looking for a new carpenter if I'm building, or a new plumber, or an accountant. Okay, he has the ability to come back and be there and do the work and deliver at the end of the day. Consistency. Now, another issue, a big issue which I have experienced, is the issue of the psychological trauma caused by the displacement. I've had an issue where I recruited a guy during the Liberian War, a Nigerian who was brought back as a refugee, brought back as a refugee. I employed him to give him an opportunity. I wake up one morning, he has no house, so I give him a space in my boys' quarter in my house. I wake up one morning and I see the guy sitting naked on a tree. Shell shock. Never saw it in my life before. I was dumbfounded. Okay, we had to get in a doctor, brought him down, ended up having to take him to a psychiatric hospital. Okay, and paid some money and life moved on. Okay, I don't know if it stayed on or what, but the point is that psychological issue is key.
We just have a few more minutes left. Do you have a question or were you making just comments?
I'm making comments that from a private sector point of view that enables, that needs to be addressed. Okay, because developmental funding is very different from private sector funding. The way we think is completely different. Completely different. Financial inclusion is fine at developmental level, but the private sector is not interested in financial inclusion. What we are interested in is paying for a service and getting return. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Behind you, there is a light behind you.
Thank you so much.
Kindly keep it short.
I'm Abdishakur from Somalia, Minister of Finance. I'm happy to see those expert panels. I would like to talk issue about the remittance. And I would like to ask those panels general question. Somalia is one of the countries using remittances in Africa. When you see in the country, we has many refugees from different countries staying in our country. Also, many Somali people, refugees, they are staying in developed countries. So, our country, we are using very, very, very high remittance. Also, our financial regulation is not allowed fully the remittance. But we see, and that is the good solution to get refugees their needs. So, I would like to ask those panel, when we talk remittance, other side is a party of terrorist finance or money laundering. So, our refugees or other refugees come from the other countries than Africa, they need to use banks. Some banks has a regulation, don't allow those people to use that banks. So, can we get, when we are using our banks, our African banks, to help that people using the banks? So the remittance is not
Shakur,
good.
sorry, could you kindly repeat the question? Just keep it short and do repeat the question.
Okay. Our refugees people, they need to use banks, but the bank regulation not allow it to use that people because of some people they don't have identity, some people they don't have residency, like that. But the remittance, for example, you are staying in a camp or in the city, you need something to help. You call your brother or your colleague or your friend staying in outside the country. You tell your needs, then he send it quickly, your money, and you can get less than 5 minutes when I talk in Somalia. So our banks, I mean all the African banks, can they get the solution? Because the remittance is a problem when we talk other sides. I mean the remittance is helping the terrorist money, terrorist financing, also is a part of money laundering. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think Diane is going to answer that.
Thank you for the question. I hope I understood well. So obviously, banks operate, in a framework. We are regulated, and this is the case for all commercial banks and even, development banks. And you need proper KYC. You need to know your client. You need to have a client who is identified for you to be able to provide the services. And as Dr. Kaberuka said, because in some areas, banks are not able to provide the services, we have a lot of innovation. We have the remittance companies that have been able to identify people who do not necessarily have a national ID or a refugee ID, but just with a fingerprint, or because they know a person, etc. So I think there's a lot of innovation that is possible in that space. But what is important is that banks are still in the background. Maybe the remittance company or the fintech is offering the services directly to the client, but these will be supported by the bank for them to allow or enable transfer of money from country to country. So the banks will play a role, not necessarily the frontline role with the clients because of the reasons I just mentioned. But the banks will be in the background to facilitate the transfers of money, etc. So I think that would be my answer to that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Up next, I'd like to balance gender, but with the lights I really can't see. So maybe the guys who have the microphones, if you could just be standing next to, yes, okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Karen Birungi. I'm from Sydney Bank in Uganda, and I'm in charge of the Refugee Financing Initiative. I have coordinated this program personally since 2018, and we've realized that there are so many things that affect financial inclusion from the banking side. And I want to throw this question to Dr. Kaberuka specifically. what are your views on segmentation? Because refugees have different clusters. A number of people speak about financial inclusion as a concept, but they never go into the detail of actually looking at the different categories of refugees. So when you look at the new arrivals, the protracted type, the permanent refugees, have all different characteristics. And when you come to the banking industry, where she represents and where I sit, we look at every niche differently. So that is where one of the participants' mechanisms come into play. The private sector, especially the financial institutions which we represent, need to be supported. They need to have de-risking mitigants for us to play into the space fairly and competitively with the natives. Now, when you look at the gender dimension, it is also another segment on its own. My personal experience is that the female refugees actually have unique characteristics compared to our male counterparts. So when we look at it as a general concept, I sometimes find it a little bit disturbing. So I want to hear from the panelists and Dr. Kaberuka specifically from his vast experience on research, what are his views on segmentation? Thank you very much.
I don't know if I have an answer for that one, but first of all, can I make a general point before I leave this room? That I hope that one day, not you or I, we really have to think about what is it that causes refugees and IDPs, because that's the easiest way to handle these issues. You know, one time about 3 years ago, I was in an American university doing a sabbatical there, and I was requested to address students on the subject of the global refugee crisis. And what I did was to do what you and I would do. I looked at the numbers. Where are the refugees? Where do they come from? What is the carrying capacity of the place where they are? And not surprising, you'll find that actually most of the refugees are in the neighboring countries of where they come from. They're in Jordan, they're in Kenya, they're here in Rwanda, they're in many places. These are countries who have limited carrying capacity, all right, with limited international support. Because often in the media, when people talk about refugees, you think they have all crossed to Europe or to the States. They're here, they're in Africa here. Same for migrants, by the way. And so this is why I keep saying to myself that at the end of the day, probably the Convention on Refugees, which dates back to 1951, I think, which was addressing a particular problem, may have to be adapted to problems of today. It's no longer simply about security of the refugees. It is about livelihoods for refugees. This is what we're discussing. And if you discuss livelihoods, it will have to be governments and business and international organizations. And to my friend from Nigeria, I want to say, by the way, the development finance institutions are no longer the DFIs of a long time ago. They now have two arms, a private sector arm, like IFC, and the public sector arm. And both have to work together, whether it is in a steady state situation or in a fragile situation. They have to work together, depending upon the dynamics of a particular place. Now, on market segmentation about refugees, I leave that to Diane, because it's a long time ago I worked in a commercial bank. I don't know how they handle this. But I want to confirm what she said before. That since the global financial crisis of 2008, regulations for banks have become very, very tight. I think compliance issues now consume so much energy and innovation. So if a bank wants to innovate, say, to address issues of IDPs and refugees, the next thing the regulators, central bank, would be coming with a tons of hammer. If they don't do it, AML, money laundering, will catch them at some point. And that's what I want to say about my colleague from Somalia. This is why I made a plea to Barclays. I understand regulators will hit you hard. I understand the issue of KYC. But can we work together with you, i.e. development finance institutions and the government of the UK, to ensure that these flows to Somalia continue? So we understood the problem, KYC, compliance. Barclays and other European banks had to observe. But there was a bigger issue there, to keep flows into Somalia, all right? where then business people are using their intelligence and innovation. Yeah. So the issue of compliance is real. Is real. And I think at some point, come to an end, or where they have moved to, it looks like it's a permanent status, then to figure out how governments and business, international organizations work together to give these people a livelihood.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, definitely. Thank you. We're going to end this conversation on that note. It is all our responsibility, as Dr. Donald Kewaruka has just said. The private sector, the public sector, we all have a role to play in this. And one key thing that I'm actually going to take away from this conversation is we still have a long way to go. The private sector can only do so much because we need the right policy frameworks in place. So I really hope that we'll continue with this conversation during the break, as well as even on social media. Let us continue discussing. Thank you so much to each and every person who followed this conversation. If you're watching this on CNBC Africa, thank you so much for tuning in. And I'd also like to thank our panelists. I'll start. We had Vusi Thembekwayo, South African venture capitalist, founding CEO of My Growth Fund and IC Knowledge Bureau. And right next to him, we have Bior Ajak, Equity Leaders Program, MasterCard Foundation Scholar. And the lady on the panel, we have Diane Karusisi, the CEO of Bank of Kigali. And right next to me is Dr. Donald Kaberuka. He is the chairman and managing partner, Southbridge, a Rwandan economist, and also the former president of the African Development Bank and board chair of the Global Fund. Thank you so much for your time. Let us just watch a few videos as we get ready to go into the next session. We'll be talking digital inclusion.